Hello there. Today we're going to talk about streamer setups specifically for trout. We're going to go over the rod type that you should consider when doing streamers, the type of line that you need to consider, tapered leaders, and some techniques and tips to help you improve your streamer fishing game. So let's talk about the rods first. Typically for trout, you're using either a 5-weight or a 6-weight rod, 9-foot, to fish streamers for trout. Now, some might argue that a 5-weight's a little bit light, but you know, as long as the streamer is not ginormous and you're not using some massive dungeon, most streamers will work on a 5-weight. You just have to take a little more time and a little more finesse in casting those big streamers. But I've caught a ton of fish on 5-weight rods. Now, if the streamer fishing is a little more intense and you need a little stronger rod, especially if you're using a sinking line, then you'll want to upgrade to a 6-weight, 9-foot rod. Now for bass, some of those streamers and poppers can get really big, and I use a 7-weight generally for bass fishing just because I want the ease of being able to throw something that big longer distances. That was awesome. And then finally, if you're getting into prehistoric type of trout, I'm talking monster giant 25+ inch trout, then you might want to consider an 8-weight if you're going after something like that. But in most cases, a 5 and a 6 are going to be just fine. So from there, we go right into the reels. So what kind of reel do you want to use? Typically, I prefer the large arbor reels. I like the fact that when you reel it in, you get a lot more line on each retrieve, having a larger arbor. Just something that I prefer using. You don't have to, but for me, I just prefer the large arbor reels. And you do want to have something with a drag system in it, because typically, if you're streamer fishing, you're not catching small fish, well, at least all the time. And it's nice to have that drag system ready to go on that fly reel. Again, don't need it. It's just what I prefer to do when I'm streamer fishing. Big shout out to one of the members. He asked to have this video made. And this is what happens. If you're a member, you can request specific videos, and that's what this is today. So thank you. So what type of lines do you want to use when streamer fishing? So there really is two options. I mean, I suppose there's a lot of options, but there's two options that I use and consistently catch fish on streamers. One is just a floating line, but you do want to have a floating line that's designed to throw bigger flies. Cortland has a streamer floating line, has a shorter taper, heavy weighted, so you can chuck out and turn over those streamers with relative ease. So you do want a fly line that's designed to throw bigger flies, and the Cortland streamer line has that design. Now, the next thing you want to consider is maybe it's not a floating line, you want a sinking line. Cortland also makes a streamer sinking line, same kind of concept, right? It's a shorter taper with a heavier head, and it has about a 25-foot section that sinks, and then all the line prior to that is all floating line. So it's like having a great big sink tip on your line. And those are the two lines that I use consistently when fishing streamers. So how do you decide whether you want to use a floating line or a sinking line in any application? It really matters where or what you are fishing. If I'm fishing a shallow or smaller stream, a lot of times the sink tip's not going to do you any good. It's just going to get you snagged on the bottom all the time. Or if I'm fishing a shallow lake, the same thing, right? You don't need to get really down there into the water column to get down where the fish are because you're fishing something shallower. Now, if I'm fishing a larger river system that's fast moving water and pretty deep and pretty big, that's when you want to consider using a sinking line, because there's no way, no matter how long that leader is, you're going to be able to get down where the fish are in something that has a heavier current or just a bigger, deeper stream. That's how I decide, right? And I'm fishing a lake that's super deep and I know the fish are probably close to the bottom, just like they might be close to the bottom on that river. That's when I decide to pull out the sink tip and have just a sinkier setup for those applications. So it really depends on where you're fishing, and you're gonna have to decide for yourself, can I reach the fish with my floating line and just a longer leader, or do I need to get down there with a sinking line to get down there and find the fish? Next is, what is the leader size? Now, this is an important subject because I learned the hard way before fishing something that's too light. If you're losing streamers on the backcast, it's because the line you're using is too light. I would not use anything lighter then 3X tippet. Typically, if fish are going after streamers, they're not going to be leader shy. So even using a 2X, 1X, or a 0X is fine. So you want to have a heavier leader whenever you're fishing streamers. On the floating line setup, I'm typically using a 3X, a 2X, or a 1X or 0X, 9 foot long, sometimes even longer. I like to be able to control the depth by just having a little bit longer leader. Okay, pro tip for you. You can use nylon tapered leaders. That's okay to use. I've done streamer fishing with nylon, but really, if you're looking to do specifically streamer fishing in a day, a lot of times fluorocarbon is a better option. Why? Fluorocarbon is a little more abrasive resistant than nylon. You're going to be getting close to the bottom in a lot of these cases, and you might be rubbing against stuff. So having that fluorocarbon that has that abrasion resistance a lot of time is nice. It also doesn't stretch as much. And what's important about that, typically when you're streamer fishing, you do not want to do a trout set. You want to do a strip set. And if you have a line that doesn't have a tendency to stretch very much, it's more positive to the fish. It's going to react quicker. So when you do that quick strip set, when you feel the hit, your hookup rating just goes up a little bit more because the line is not going to stretch or give at all. It's going to punch it right into that fish's face. So that's why I typically use a fluorocarbon tapered leader or tippet when I am fishing these streamers. Now, if I need to really get down there in depth charge and I'm putting the sinking line on, that's where you can go with as little as a 4-foot leader. And now I have tied my own leader just using tippet material, 0X tippet, just tied a perfection loop and then put loop to loop on the end of the sinking line and just had a little 4-foot section. That just gives you a little more control on where you are in depth wise. If you have really long leaders when sink tips, a lot of times the fly will really start sinking down further than the line and you're going to be snagging the bottom often. So shorter leaders generally work better with sinking lines, and I would say between 4 feet and 7.5 feet is about as long as you want to go. Now they do make a 7.5 foot tapered leader, you know, one half dozen the other. If you're just using straight tippet, I wouldn't go any longer than 4 feet because then you might have a problem with rolling the fly over on the cast. The taper helps roll that over, but when you're using short sections, a lot of times it doesn't make any difference. So 4 to 7.5 feet on sinking lines. So I know the next question that many of you are going to have are, what are some of my favorite streamer patterns? Now, I've got a lot, but there are a few that always seem to deliver. One is the Sculptzilla, both in the smaller and the larger size. I kind of like the natural colors, whether it's olive or whether it's tan and sometimes white. These things are just deadly accurate. It doesn't matter where I'm fishing, in lakes or rivers, the Sculptzilla really is my #1 streamer pattern. Next would be the sparkle minnows. Those just do really well, especially on bright, sunny days. It just really pops and seems to get the fish active. So I would definitely get some sparkle minnows. And next is some of the articulated dungeons. And I do kind of prefer the yellows and olives in those articulated dungeons. Having that articulation just gives it a little bit more movement. I like it when the hook is further back, and that's the nice thing about the Sculptzilla too. The hook's way in the back. So when you get a lot of strikes, you just have a better chance at hookup when the hook's a little further back on the rear end of that streamer pattern. But those 3 are really my top go-to streamers. Now I have a ton of streamers in my box, but it seems like I'm always tying on one of those 3. Now there are a couple of different knots that you can use, and one that you should consider using when streamer fishing. First, you can use the improved clinch knot, not a problem at all. But a lot of times when you're using heavier fly line, you don't get a lot of play between the fly line and where it's attached to the fly. And a lot of times if you've got some fish that are being kind of persnickety, you might want to add a little extra movement to that streamer, and there's a specific knot that you can tie that really adds a ton of movement to that streamer. And especially when you're using the thicker line, it's not just this rigid line to streamer and, you know, it's just kind of following it around in the exact space where that line is. So I would consider using kind of a modified Duncan loop, and I've got a really easy way to tie it. And I'll put this video right up here for you so you can see just how to tie this knot. And again, if you're part of the membership group, thank you. And if you're considering it, some of the cool perks is to be able to suggest videos to me, and I'll go ahead and make them for you. All right, till the next time, everybody, fish on.